The DMV waiting room smelled like fluorescent lighting and deeply questionable decisions, which felt entirely appropriate. I was there for my second driving retest in 4 months, which meant I had already failed one, which meant I had already sat in a car with a stranger holding a clipboard and been found insufficient. I was ready for stranger number 2. I was absolutely not ready for the woman who came through the door with a clipboard and a name tag, and the same green eyes that had looked at me across a lab table for 2 years of high school and then gone very still the night I told her I had found a different date to our senior prom. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. The name tag said Kinsley, V. Examiner, which was the first thing I managed to read after my brain finished the approximately 4-second process of refusing to accept what my eyes were telling it. The second thing I read was her face. Vera Kinsley's face had not aged in any of the ways I had spent 11 years unconsciously expecting faces to age. It had simply settled the specific settling of a person who had decided, somewhere between 18 and 29, exactly who they were going to be, and had been that person consistently enough for it to show. She was composed in the way she had always been composed, not closed off, not performing distance, just complete in herself in a way that other people had to work very hard to seem, and she simply was. You could walk into a room and see her, and understand immediately that nothing in the room was going to surprise her in a way she could not account for. That was, I realized standing up from a plastic chair in a DMV waiting room at 9:17 on a Thursday morning, both deeply reassuring and extremely inconvenient, given what was about to happen. She crossed the lobby from the staff corridor, with the economy of someone who had made this particular crossing enough times to do it without navigating. The clipboard was against her forearm. Her gray examiner's uniform was fitted in the exact, unpretentious way she had always worn clothes not expensively, just precisely right for the purpose. Her hair was shorter than it had been at 18, cropped close, pinned today, with the deliberate restraint of a woman who had made a specific decision about the version of herself she was going to bring to a professional space. She stopped at the intake desk. She spoke to the clerk, Patrice, according to the name tag. A woman whose face carried the warm, comprehensive awareness of someone who had worked a public-facing government job long enough to develop genuine affection for the whole complicated range of humanity that walked through those doors. Vera took the folder Patrice extended, opened it, looked at the form. Then she looked up, across the waiting room, at me. There was a moment. I cannot tell you its full contents, because I was busy having it. But I can tell you it lasted less than 3 seconds, that her face did not change in any perceptible way during those 3 seconds, and that she held the eye contact for exactly as long as was professionally reasonable before she looked back at the form. Malone, she said. She used my last name. That was the first deliberate decision she made about how we were going to do this. Here, I said. I stood up from the plastic chair. I was 30 years old and I stood up like I had been called on in a class I had studied the wrong chapter for. Vera moved toward me across the lobby, with the clipboard against her forearm and those green eyes doing the thing they had always done, the specific quality of attention she brought to everything she looked at, not assessing exactly, not hard, just complete. The kind of looking that made you feel like the most real object in whatever room you were sharing. In high school, I had told myself this was because she was intelligent, and intelligent people paid better attention to the world around them. I was 30 now. I had several additional years of self-knowledge to draw on, and I no longer believed that particular explanation had ever fully believed itself. This is your second attempt, she said. Third, actually, I said. The form says second. The form is counting official DMV evaluations. I hired a private driving instructor between the first DMV attempt and today. We parted ways before the certification could be completed. Third, in spirit. She looked at me for a measured beat. Then she made a notation on the form. Follow me, she said. I followed her. I want to tell you about the 2 years in AP Chemistry, because nothing that is about to happen makes any sense without them. They were junior and senior year. We were assigned to the same bench at the start of junior year, not by design, just by the particular randomness of alphabetical lab assignments and the way that randomness sometimes lands with the precision of something that was supposed to happen. She introduced herself in the straightforward way she did everything. Her name, her grade, the fact that she had tested out of the preceding chemistry sequence, so she was here on merit rather than progression. Just the accurate information, delivered efficiently. Her name was Vera Kinsley. She wanted to be a civil engineer. She was in AP chemistry because she was good at it, not because it looked right on a record. She held her pen with her left hand, which I noticed in the first 10 minutes, and cataloged without understanding why I was cataloging it. We became the kind of lab partners who genuinely work. Not the kind who split the effort along fault lines of ambition and avoidance, but the kind who argued about the methodology before reaching the same conclusion, who stayed past the bell because the titration had not resolved cleanly, and neither of us could leave a thing unresolved. We studied on Thursday afternoons in the library, at a table by the window, and talked about the problems, and then talked about other things, her father's habit of narrating road trips in the voice of a documentary, my grandmother's conviction that the correct way to learn anything was to do it wrong as many times as necessary until you understood why you were wrong, the specific satisfaction of a lab result that came out exactly as the theory predicted it would, the specific injustice of one that did not, the particular taxonomy of teachers who were brilliant and teachers who were organized, and how rarely you got both at once. By the middle of senior year, I had been cataloging what she did for approximately 14 months. The way she held her pen, the way she tilted her head when a formula was refusing to cooperate, and she was running the experiment backward through her mind, looking for the wrong step. The smell of something cedar adjacent that she carried from wherever it came from, a soap, a jacket, the apartment she lived in that I had never identified precisely but could have located in a dark room. The way she said my name, Bex, never the full version, never with anything appended, just the single syllable in her particular register, like it was exactly the right length. The way she was quiet when she was thinking and present when she was not, the two states were completely distinct, and I had learned to read the difference within the first month, and I checked for it every session after that without deciding to. In March of senior year, she asked me to prom. She did it at the bench, while she was writing up the results of a titration experiment. Not a speech, not a constructed moment. She said, while her pen was moving across the lab notebook, that she had been thinking about the prom situation, and would it be easier if we just went together, since neither of them seemed to be managing a date, and they both had better things to spend their attention on. She said it in the same register she used to ask if I wanted to divide the write-up or work through the second problem set Thursday. I said yes before I processed the full sentence. And then 2 weeks later, in the hallway between 4th and 5th period, Marcus Hale asked me. Marcus Hale was a perfectly decent person. He was bright enough, genuinely kind, and clearly interested. He asked with the direct enthusiasm of someone who had not thought too hard about the asking and did not need to. And I looked at him in the hallway and I thought, briefly and incompletely, about Vera. And then I said yes. I said yes to Marcus. And I went home, and I made a phone call, and I said to Vera that I had found a different date, so she did not have to worry about taking me as a friend. Those were my exact words, so she did not have to worry about it. I heard the silence on the other end. I heard the very careful, very specific way she said, "That's fine, it's not a problem," and I told myself that was just how she talked about everything. I went to prom with Marcus Hale. I spent 2 hours in the parking lot while Marcus was inside dancing, and I thought about Vera Kinsley the entire time, not with any particular resolution, not with any particular plan, just the persistent, inconvenient presence of her in a context where she was not present, and I could not figure out why that felt like the wrong arrangement. I went home and spent the following 6 months telling myself what I was thinking about was the friendship. By 24 I had the vocabulary, by 27 I had the full, honest accounting. By 28 I had run into someone in a gallery who knew someone who had gone to school with someone who had mentioned Vera Kinsley had moved back to the city, and I had filed this information and done nothing with it, which was exactly what I had done with all the other information, which was the problem. By 29 I was sitting in a plastic chair in a DMV waiting room having not acted on any of it, which was the fact that mattered. The car was a white sedan, Standard government fleet, parked in the second row of the lot with the bland functional adequacy of a vehicle whose only job was to be safe and neutral and consistent. Vera opened the passenger side first, handed the keys across the roof, went around. Her hand and mine were not quite close on the handoff. There was the appropriate professional distance of a key being transferred from examiner to examinee. I registered it anyway. I settled into the driver's seat and placed my hands at 10 and 2 before she had finished arranging the clipboard on her knee. She looked at the position of my hands, made a notation, and I thought about how the notation was probably positive and how completely unreasonable it was that I cared whether her notations were positive. "Before you begin," she said, "I need to confirm your identification and acknowledge the reason for the license suspension." She ran through the procedure. I answered. She asked about the suspension, the specific violations, the accumulated points, the rolling 12-month window that had turned a series of individually survivable decisions into a license revocation. I answered without elaboration. She finished the documentation, looked at the road ahead. "When you are ready," she said. I drove. The first 8 minutes were the cleanest driving I had produced in any evaluated context since the original suspension. I had spent 3 weeks in deliberate preparation, not the anxious over-drilling of someone who did not trust their hands, but the patient repetition of someone who wanted the behaviors to sit below the level of conscious effort, so that whatever was happening in the passenger seat could not reach down and disrupt them. Mirror checks at every interval, signal timing that was early rather than exactly on time, following distance maintained with awareness. I came to complete stops. I maintained posted speed. Vera did not speak except to give directions. Turn right at the light, continue on Hargrove Avenue, merge left when safe. Her voice in the car had the same register as the lab-specific, unhurried, containing exactly what was required and nothing surplus. She sat with her eyes on the road ahead and the clipboard on one knee, and her free hand resting at the base of the passenger window frame. The car smelled like hand sanitizer and fleet vehicle neutrality, and underneath both of those things, so faint I was not entirely certain I was not inventing it, cedar. I did nothing with the information. "Turn right onto Callaway at the next block," she said. Callaway was residential, older neighborhood, parked cars on both sides. The particular narrowness of streets that had been designed before parking was a problem and had never been redesigned to account for it becoming one. I saw the orange evaluation cones at the far end of the block before she spoke. "Parallel park in the space indicated when you are ready," she said. I pulled even with the vehicle ahead of the space and began the maneuver. My angle going in was correct. I had drilled parallel parking in the lot of my apartment building at 6 in the morning for 3 consecutive days, and the approach was automatic, my hands moving into position before my conscious attention had finished asking them to. The initial arc was clean. The check over my right shoulder was clean. I had the space handled. Then a dog barked in the yard of the second house on the left. Sudden, single bark, directly to my left. My hands tightened on the wheel for less than half a second. The rear of the car tracked 2 inches further out than it should have. I corrected. I completed the park. I shut off the engine and looked at the gap between the bumper and the curb. Legal, not excellent. Vera was writing. "Points were deducted on the parallel parking," I said. She paused with the pen. "Yes," she said. "How many?" She looked at the form, then at me. 7. I ran the math. I had been building cleanly before the cones. 7 points off a score that had been approaching the high 90s put me at somewhere in the low 80s. Still passing. The threshold was 75. 7 points is within the passing threshold. "It is," she said. "The deduction is for technique rather than the legal standard." The final position. 2.4 inches from the curb. She said it the way she said everything, with the precision of someone reading from an instrument that had no stake in its own measurement. She was not wrong. The deduction was accurate. I said, "You can note that the approach angle was clean." She said, "It's already noted." I looked at the steering wheel. Then the windshield. Then, because I had never developed the reliable ability to keep my eyes off her for long when she was this close, at her, she was completing the notation. The pen moved with the same deliberate pace as everything. She did not hurried, not labored, exactly as fast as the work required. Her jaw was set in the working way it got when she was solving something. Her eyes were on the form. "Start the vehicle," she said, without looking up. I started the vehicle. The remainder of the route took 20 minutes. Highway on-ramp and merge. The downtown grid, including a pedestrian crossing where I stopped further back than strictly required, a cautious error rather than a dangerous one, the kind that gets noted rather than penalized. The three-point turn on Linden Avenue went without incident. I had drilled it until it was mechanical, and it showed in the way mechanical things show, not gracefully, but reliably. I was, on balance, a better driver at 30 than I had been at 22, which said something about what the intervening years had done to my relationship with things I could and could not control. We pulled back into the DMV lot. She made the final set of notations. I sat with my hands in my lap and watched the street beyond the lot, and did the math again and concluded I had passed, and then waited to hear that I had passed rather than saying so. "Congratulations," she said. "You have passed the road test portion of the evaluation." I released a breath I had been holding in installments since I pulled out of the lot 40 minutes ago. "Your paperwork will be processed inside," she said. "Restricted license issued today, pending system verification. Full license reinstated in 30 days if there are no further violations." "Understood," I said. She opened her door. I opened mine. We stood on either side of the car in the lot with the completed form between us across the roof, her fingers at one corner, mine at the other. She let go first, with the clean economy of a handoff that had no more weight than it needed to. "Congratulations," she said again. The same level tone, the same professional distance she had been maintaining since the waiting room. She turned and walked toward the building. I stood in the lot and watched her cross the asphalt the way I had watched her cross things, lab floors and hallways, and the parking lot of the graduation party I had attended, specifically because I heard she would be there, and then spent the entire evening on the wrong side of a yard pretending I did not know why I had come. She moved the same way. Nothing about that had changed. I went inside. Patrice took my form, scanned it, frowned with the specific quality of a frown that means administrative bad news rather than personal bad news. "The system is running slow," she said. "Digital verification is about 40 minutes behind." I looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I know," she said. "You can wait in the lobby, or the break room down the hall has better coffee." Someone made enough complaints that we finally got a real machine. I found the break room. It was small, fluorescent, and had the functional warmth of institutional spaces where people came to remember they were not only their professional functions. Round table, 4 chairs, a window looking onto the staff lot. The coffee maker was genuinely good. I made a cup. Sat at the table. My phone had 3 messages from Danny Holt in the sequence that meant she had sent the first one, waited 4 minutes, sent the second, waited 2, sent the third. "Well, Bex, this is physically hurting me. Please confirm alive and licensed." "Passed," I texted back. "System is down, waiting for the license to process." Her response was immediate. Was it her? I put the phone face down on the table. Danny Holt had been my best friend since 3rd grade. She had known about Vera Kinsley since 10 minutes after prom ended, which was how long it had taken me to call her from the parking lot of the venue, where I had spent 2 hours sitting in my car instead of on the dance floor. I had told her the incoherent version, the part where Marcus had been fine, the part where I had not been able to go inside, the part where I had spent the entire drive home thinking about whether Vera had gone with someone else or alone, or not at all. Donnie had listened to all of it and said, in the patient and gentle tone of a girl who had already figured something out about me, "Bex, I think you have a problem." I had told her she was misreading it. She had not argued. She had filed the information and waited. Danny's patience in this specific area was something I had benefited from for 22 years and had never fully deserved. The break room door opened. Vera came in. She had the clipboard still against her arm, and the professional composure she had worn since the waiting room, and she was 3 steps inside the room before she saw me at the table. The adjustment was minimal, not a stop, not a flinch, just the very slight recalibration of a person who had found a room she expected to be empty, occupied by a variable she had not accounted for. The recalibration lasted less than a second. The composure resumed without gap. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know the room was occupied." Patrice sent me here to wait, I said. Systems down. She moved to the coffee maker, made her cup with the same economy she brought to everything, not performing indifference, not performing awareness, just making coffee because she needed coffee, and the machine was there. She stood at the counter with the cup in both hands, and her back not fully to me, her gaze on the window and the staff lot beyond it, where the white fleet vehicles were parked in their orderly row. "We are not going to do this here," she said. She had not turned around when she said it. She said it to the window. "I haven't said anything yet," I said. "You are about to. I considered this. You can tell?" After a moment, the lab table version of you had a very specific quality when you were working up to saying something you weren't certain you were allowed to say. You went still in a particular way. It was always the first indicator. I looked at my cup. "That's 11 years of observational data you're working from. Some things don't change," she said. She turned. Not all the way. She leaned against the counter with the cup in both hands, half facing the window, half facing me, and in the break room light her face was doing the careful thing it did when it was deciding between the accurate response and the managed one. She had been doing this for 11 years. She had been better at it than I had. "The test is over, Malone," she said. "You passed." "I know I passed. Your license is being processed." "I know. You don't have anything unresolved with this office." I said. "I used the wrong words in March of senior year." She said nothing. I said, "The words I used implied the invitation had been made out of obligation, that I had said yes to going with you as a friend, doing another friend a courtesy, and that the courtesy was no longer necessary because I had found a different arrangement. Those were not the accurate words for the reason I rescinded." A very long silence. The break room ventilation moved air through the building. Somewhere in the lobby, a ticket number was called. "I know," she said, quietly, looking at the window. "I know you know," I said. "I think you've known for a while." She looked at me. Her eyes in the break room light were the same green they had been across a lab bench, not softer than professional, not harder, just the same complete attention aimed at the same problem. She said, "What were the accurate words?" I said yes because I wanted to go with you, not as a friend. Because something had been building at that bench for a year and a half, and when you asked me, in the lab, the way you asked me, I understood what the asking meant, and I said yes because I meant it that way. She looked at the window again. The fleet vehicles. The October sky above the staff lot, flat and gray. "And then," I said yes to Marcus because he was legible to me. I understood the shape of that situation, and I did not understand the shape of the other one yet. And I told you, I had found a different date, and used language that made the whole original arrangement sound like charity rather than preference, because I was 17, and I did not have the vocabulary for the honest version. She was very still. I said, "I have spent approximately 7 years sitting with the honest version, doing nothing particularly useful with it." She set her cup down in the sink. It was a precise motion, a decision being made. She said, "I called you 3 weeks after." I said, "I remember." She said, "I called because I had finished working out the part I had been explaining to myself as something else." I said, "What part?" She said, "Why I had asked you, in the lab, in that register, why I had waited until the titration write-up to say it, and said it the way I said it, rather than any other way." I said, "What had you been explaining it as?" She said, "Practicality. That going to prom with someone I was comfortable with was simpler than navigating the social machinery of finding a date from outside our existing situation. That you were the most convenient available person, and the proposal made logistical sense." I said, "And after you worked out the other part?" She said, "After that I understood that the convenient version was a construction, and the actual version had nothing to do with logistics. The break room was the size it was. It had always been exactly this size. Vera was standing at the counter 6 feet from where I was sitting at the table, and the 6 feet had the specific quality of distance that is measured in something other than feet." I said, "What did you do with that?" She said, "I went to college in a different state. I studied what I had planned to study. I built the career I intended to build. I moved back 4 years ago to be closer to my family and took the examiner certification because I needed the ground-level infrastructure work that I could not get from consultation alone. The break room was the size it was. It had always been exactly this size. Vera was standing at the counter 6 feet from where I was sitting at the table, and the 6 feet had the specific quality of distance that is measured in something other than feet. I said, "And you never looked me up?" She said, "No." I said, "Why?" She looked at the window, the gray sky, the orderly vehicles. "Because looking you up would have required deciding what I wanted to say after finding you," she said. And I had not arrived at the version of that yet. I said, "What version?" She said, "The honest one." I held that. She said, "I was not angry with you. I want to be precise about that. I eventually understood what had happened and why you made the choice you made. The anger was not the primary thing." I said, "What was the primary thing?" She said, "The understanding that the conversation we would eventually need to have would require me to say things I was not ready to say. So I didn't look." I said, "And now?" She turned from the window and looked at me directly across the 6 feet and the break room and the 11 years and everything in between. "Today," she said, "you walked into my DMV." I said, "I didn't know it was yours." "I know you didn't," she said it simply, without accusation. "It doesn't change the fact." I said, "Vera." She said, "Yes." I said, the words I should have used in March of senior year. She waited. Completely still, in the way she was still when she had decided to let something come to her, rather than move to manage it. I said, "The accurate version is this. I said yes to your invitation because I wanted to go with you, not as a friend. Because I had spent 14 months at a bench understanding something about you that I did not have the language for, and when you asked me it sounded exactly like the thing I had been waiting for you to ask, and saying yes was the most honest thing I had done in months. And then 2 weeks later I said yes to Marcus because he was visible and legible, and I understood how to be in that situation in a way I did not understand how to be in the other one. And I used the wrong words with you because 17 was too young to be honest about the thing I was being dishonest about." A silence. She said, "I was 24 when I understood it fully." I said, "What did you do with it?" She said, "I wrote a letter. I did not send it." I said, "Where is it now?" She said, "I burned it at 26. I had decided by then that the burning was the point rather than the sending." I said, "What did it say?" She looked at me for a long time. The composure was working, it was always working, but in the break room light, in this room, without the car and the road test and the professional frame around it, I could see the composure for what it was. Not a wall, just a foundation. Real, load-bearing, but no longer functioning as concealment. She said, "Your license will be ready when the system clears." I said, "That is not an answer." "I know," she said. She put her cup in the sink. She moved toward the door. She stopped in the threshold shoulder to the frame, the particular stopped quality of someone who has decided to say one more true thing before leaving. The thing they have already decided, before they stopped, and are now simply executing. That was always how she did it. Without turning all the way around, the angle on the parallel park was clean. "I want you to know I noted it." I said, "I know the angle was clean." She said, "The final position was the problem, not the approach." She left. I sat in the break room for 24 minutes until Patrice knocked on the door frame and said the system had cleared. I went to the front desk, signed the forms, collected the restricted license, thanked Patrice, who received the thanks with the warmth of a woman who had been watching something specific develop through a glass partition all morning and had come to her own conclusions about it. In the parking lot I called Danny. She picked up on the first ring. "All of it," she said. "Right now." "I passed," I said. "I know you passed. What happened in the building?" I told her about the break room, the exchange at the counter, the way Vera had said the angle was clean and the final position was the problem. I said it in the flat, imprecise way you report things when you are still in the processing stage rather than the articulation stage. Danny was quiet for a moment. She said, "Okay. The approach was right, and the position needs recalibration. That's what she said, I confirmed. Bex, said Danny, you know that is not a parking metaphor. I know it is not a parking metaphor. She said the approach was right. Out loud, in those words. I know what she said. Another pause. Then, what are you going to do? I leaned against the side of my car and looked at the DMV entrance. At the glass door through which Patrice was visible behind her desk. I need to think about it, I said. What's left to think about? She told you the approach was right. The position still needs work, I said. Danny said. Bex. I know, I said. Call me in 3 days, Danny said. With an update. 3 days felt like the right interval. 3 days felt like the length of time it takes to go from knowing something in the general sense to knowing it in the specific enough sense that you can do something with it. I drove home with my restricted license and the particular clarity that comes when you have said a long-deferred true thing out loud and put it somewhere it can be responded to instead of carried. The 3 days were what 3 days are when you have made a decision and are waiting for the calendar to give you permission to act on it. I went to work. I ran my route through the park at 6 each morning. I had dinner with Danny on Wednesday, and she brought it up within 40 seconds of sitting down. What exactly are you afraid of? She asked. That 11 years is too much, I said. That is a you reason, not a Vera reason. She looked at me over her glass. She told you the approach was right. She also said the position needed recalibration, which means it's not currently right. She said it needed work, Danny said. Not that it was impossible. She told you to run the approach again with the final position as the specific target. Bex. She gave you instructions. I looked at the wall of the restaurant, which had a photograph of a river at sunrise with no bearing on the conversation. She burned the letter, I said. At 26, she decided burning was the point. Maybe at 26 it was, Danny said. She's 29 now. I went back the following Thursday. I had no administrative reason to go back. My license was valid and issued. My remaining obligation to the DMV was simply not to accumulate more points for 30 days. Nothing required my presence in that building. I walked through the glass door at 9:15. Patrice looked up and said, Malone, in the tone of a woman who was neither surprised nor unsurprised, just present. I don't have an appointment, I said. I know, she said. I was hoping to ask if Examiner Kinsley has any availability. Patrice looked at the computer. She looked at me. She picked up the desk phone and said something quiet into it. Put it down. Break at 10:15, she said. You're welcome to wait. I sat in the same plastic chair. The waiting room had its same population, the democratic range of everyone with complicated relationships to operating a motor vehicle, which is to say everyone who drives. A teenager with a paper study guide was mouthing questions to herself in the corner. An older man in work boots was reading something on his phone. A woman my age with a sleeping toddler in a stroller was looking at the ceiling with the very specific expression of a parent who has calculated exactly how long the nap needs to last. I watched the door to the staff corridor. Vera came through it at 10:13. She had the clipboard. She stopped when she saw me across the lobby. The controlled non-reaction lasted a full second this time, longer than last week, which was information. The second retest's 0-second version had been professional neutrality. 1 full second meant something was being managed that had not needed managing before. She crossed the lobby. She said, "Follow me." The break room was the same room, same fluorescent, same round table, same window onto the staff lot. Same covered bridge calendar on the wall. She left the door half open. She stood at the counter with the clipboard still against her arm and her eyes on me across the small space. "You passed last Thursday," she said. "I know. Your license was issued." "I know. You have no remaining administrative business with this office." "Not currently," I said. "I have a question." She held the clipboard against her arm and waited with the patience of someone who had decided to let this arrive at its own speed. I said, "Is there a process for changing the examiner of record?" She looked at me for a long moment. The composure was working, and I was reading what the composure was working to contain, the way I had been reading her for 11 years across distances and contexts, and the particular difficulty of things that are true but unnamed. "There is," she said. "What does it involve?" she said. Assigned request at the front desk, citing preference or scheduling conflict. 3 business days for the change to process, I said. And during those 3 days, she said, professional distance would be maintained, as required, I said. And after 3 business days, she was quiet for a moment. The break room, the coffee maker, the October sky through the window, she said, quietly, in the register she used when she was saying the true version of something rather than the constructed one. After 3 days, the examiner of record would no longer be your examiner. I held her gaze. She said, the approach was correct. You heard that correctly last Thursday. I said, I heard it. She said, the position requires the recalibration I mentioned. I said, I understand that. I have the time. She looked at me. Really looked. In the break room, without the car between us, without the road test, without the 11 years pretending to be something other than 11 years. In the professional context, she had built and maintained with precision since the moment she had walked through the waiting room door 2 Thursdays ago. The professional context was still technically present, but its walls were made of different material now. Both of us could see through them. Her hand on the clipboard loosened, just slightly. Just enough to notice. She said, the form is at the front desk. I said, I'll get it on my way out. She said, Bex. My name, the whole version, in her mouth. Not Malone, Bex. The way she had said it in the lab, not with anything appended, just the word by itself in her particular register. Except different now. Different in a way that had nothing to do with 11 years of elapsed time and everything to do with the decision she had made between last Thursday and this Thursday about how she was going to say it. I said, I'm going to get the form. She said, I know. I said, I'll see you in 3 business days. She said, that is how the process works. I went to the door. I stopped in the threshold and looked back at her. The position was the problem, I said, not the approach. She said, no, not the approach. I went to the front desk. Patrice already had the form out. That's the examiner of record change request, she said. She smoothed it on the counter. She handed me a pen without being asked. I signed it, dated it, slid it back. Patrice took it, dated her copy, stamped it with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been watching something develop for 2 Thursdays from a front row seat and had been patient enough to let it arrive without interference. 3 business days, she said. 3 business days, I said. I walked out into the October morning with my restricted license and a stamped government form and the specific lightness of having finally put a thing in the right place after carrying it wrong for longer than it should have taken. The DMV parking lot was the same lot. The fleet vehicles were in their orderly row. The sky was flat and gray, and entirely unconcerned with what had just happened inside the building. I called Donnie from the lot. I was standing next to my car in the October morning with the DMV behind me and the fleet vehicles in their orderly row and the particular feeling of someone who has done something irreversible and is waiting for the air around the puck decision to settle. She answered before the first ring finished. What happened? I said. I filed a government form. A silence. She said, you filed a government form. I said, the administrative process required one. She said, Bex. You filed an official government form to ask Vera Kinsley out. I said, when you phrase it that way, it sounds less efficient than it was. She made a sound I had not heard from her in 31 years of friendship. Then she said, I'm calling this a win. Unambiguously. Day 4. Day 4, I said. I started my car. Hands at 10 and 2, out of habit and perhaps something that was not purely habit. Checked my mirrors. Signaled before the lane change. Full stop at the lot exit before pulling into traffic. Behind the glass of the DMV, visible through the door for exactly 2 seconds before the angle changed, Patrice was at her desk. Filing things, moving paper, being present in the way she was always present, steady, aware, keeping her own counsel about the things that were not hers to say. 3 business days, I thought. I could do 3 business days. 3 business days is 68 working hours by the standard calculation, which I know because I looked it up on the DMV's official website in the parking lot of my apartment building that same afternoon. I confirmed that I had filed a form that would take 68 hours to resolve, and that the 68 hours had not yet started because the business day had technically ended. I confirmed this twice. The number remained 68. Friday I went to my studio. I am a UX designer, which means my work is primarily visual and requires the kind of sustained attention that Friday was not cooperating with at full capacity. I produced clean, competent work at the efficiency of someone operating on the portion of their attention not occupied by a break room and an October parking lot, and the specific way certain green eyes look in fluorescent light after 11 years of not seeing them in any light at all. Danny came over Saturday evening. She sat at my kitchen table and looked at me with the specific patience she had developed over 31 years of being my person. "How are you?" she said. The actual question, not the greeting version. "I'm waiting," I said. "I know you're waiting. How are you doing while you're waiting?" I sat down across from her. The apartment smelled like the dinner I had made. The October rain was doing something to the windows that was not dramatic but was persistent. I said, "I keep thinking about the letter." She looked at her glass. "She wrote it at 24, I said. "Burned it at 26. Bought a lighter specifically to burn it, which means the burning was planned. It was a decision, not an impulse." Danny said, "What does that mean to you?" I said, "It means she understood what she was doing. She wrote it to find out what was in it, not to send to complete the experiment. The burning was the conclusion of the experiment, not giving up on the thing itself." Danny said, "That is a generous interpretation." I said, "I spent 2 years at a bench learning how she thinks. The generous interpretation is the accurate one." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "What do you think was in it?" I said, "The same thing she said in the break room, in the earlier version, with more of the working out still showing." Danny said, "She's going to say it to you, the full version." I said, "I think she might." She said, "And then?" I said, "And then I'm going to say mine." Danny looked at me. 31 years of friendship, and she still occasionally made the expression of someone encountering genuinely new information. "You have a version," she said. I said, "I have always had a version. I just have not had the right conditions for it." She said, "The form was the invitation. The conditions are 3 business days from now." I said, "And then?" She looked at me. "You know, and then," she said, "you've always known." She drove home in the rain, and I lay in the dark and thought about a letter written in a different city when Vera Kinsley was 24 and trying to find out what she was carrying. I thought about the burning and what it meant to buy a lighter specifically, for that specific purpose. I thought about the burning and what it meant to buy a lighter specifically. I thought about the very careful way she had said the burning was the point rather than the sending, and what that said about someone who treated every decision as deliberate. Sunday, I ran longer than Saturday, made better coffee than Friday, sat at the kitchen table with my sketchbook and worked through a project that was not due for 3 weeks and did not require my attention, which was a way of having my hands moving while the rest of me waited for Monday morning. Monday came. 3 business days, done. I did not text first. I had decided on Thursday that the next contact belonged to Vera. She had the form. She had the information. She understood what it meant, and whether she wanted to act on what it meant was hers to answer. The form was the last showing up I was going to do until she told me whether she wanted more of them. Monday passed without contact. Tuesday I went to the studio and produced good work and did not count the hours between the processed form and the phone I was not checking. On Tuesday evening at 6:43, my phone showed a text from V. Kinsley. It said, "The form processed this morning." I looked at it for a moment. Then I texted back, "I know." 3 minutes later, "Are you available Thursday evening?" I looked at this for considerably longer. Then I said, "Yes." She sent an address. A coffee place in the neighborhood halfway between the DMV and my apartment, which meant she knew approximately where I lived, which meant she had looked, which was a fact that sat in my chest, with the specific weight of something confirmed rather than assumed. 7 o'clock, she said. Civilian clothes. I read the last part twice. Civilian clothes, like she was specifying something that needed to be named. Like she was telling me, the person who arrives on Thursday will not be Examiner Kinsley, will not have the clipboard. Will not have the name tag, or the professional distance, or any of the structures that had been doing the managing for the past 2 weeks. I texted, understood. Danny texted the next afternoon. Anything yet? Thursday evening, I said. She suggested it. 3 seconds. She suggested it? She texted first, I said. A longer pause. Then, okay, I need you to understand that I have been waiting 12 years for this. I said, 11. I didn't know what it was for the first year. She said, I knew before you did. I've been waiting 12. This was accurate. I did not dispute it. Thursday arrived the way days arrive when you have been counting them both faster and slower than they should be. I worked until 4. Went home. Chose dark jacket, gray shirt, simple. Not performing effort or indifference. I arrived at 6:55, ordered at the counter, and sat at a window table where the October evening was doing its wet things to the pavement outside. October in this city was not dramatic, just the honest gray and drizzle of a season changing without performance, which I had always found more reliable than the seasons that announced themselves. She arrived at 7:02. I had not seen Vera Kinsley in civilian clothes. In 2 weeks of knowing she existed as an adult in the same city, the examiner's uniform had been the only version I had. And there is something specifically disorienting about seeing a person you have known in one context appear in another. The new context does not erase the previous one, but adds to it. Layers it. Makes the person both more familiar and entirely new at the same time. She wore dark jeans and a dark green jacket, the collar turned up against the drizzle. Her hair was down. I had not seen her hair down. It was the same near black it had been at 18, slightly shorter now, and without the pin, it fell against her jaw in the way things do when they have been contained all day and have been released not dramatically, just naturally, exactly as it wanted to be. She was carrying nothing. No clipboard, no folder, no professional architecture around her, just herself in a coffee place at 7 o'clock on a Thursday in October. She ordered. She came to the table. She sat down across from me and set her cup between her hands and looked at me for a moment. Hi, I said. Hi, she said. We looked at each other across the table with the specific attention of two people who have been on a very long approach to this moment and are now in it and are taking the time to register that they are in it. I said, your hair is down. She said, it's not a work night. I said, I have never seen it down, as an adult. I had data points from high school, but they were incomplete. The corner of her mouth moved. 1 millimeter. You always cataloged things, she said. I said, 2 years at a bench. It's a long time. She looked at her cup. She said, I meant to text Sunday evening. I waited until Tuesday. I said, why? She said, because I needed to be certain I was texting because it was the right decision and not because I had been sitting with the processed form all Sunday and wanted contact. I said, is there a difference? She said, yes. The first is a decision. The second is a reaction. I try not to act on the second. I said, and Tuesday it was the first. She said, Tuesday, I understood that the processed form resolved the professional context, that the next choice was only a choice, nothing enabling it, nothing complicating it, just the choice itself. I said, and you chose to ask if I was available. She said, there is a distinction between choosing to ask and choosing yes. I said, not much of one. She looked at me. No, she said, not much. The coffee place was warm and narrow and had the acoustic quality of a room designed for actual conversation, sound absorbed rather than reflected, the distance between tables calibrated to present but not adjacent. It was the kind of coffee place that had been there for a long time and understood its purpose was to be a place people came to, rather than a place they passed through. A couple near the back, not talking, just comfortable in the same space. An older man reading a physical newspaper with the focused intention of someone making a point about what constituted reading. I said, what was in the letter? She looked at her cup. I said, you don't have to answer that. I know, she said. She looked at the window. The drizzle. I'll answer it. A pause. Not avoidance consideration. Vera considered things before she said them. This was the specific quality of a person who understood that accuracy required thought before language, and who had enough respect for both to take the time. She said, "I wrote it when I was 24. I had been in a relationship for about 8 months, and I understood, roughly 6 months in, that I was in it partly as a genuine choice and partly as a way of establishing that the other thing was still not active." I said, "The other thing?" She said, "What I had been carrying since the lab." I said nothing. She said, "The relationship ended cleanly and well. We remained friendly. And when it ended, I sat with what I had been carrying and understood that the relationship's purpose had partly been to give it a container, and that without the container, I needed to decide what to do with it directly." I said, "So you wrote the letter?" She said, "To understand what the thing was. You write something to find out what it contains. The sending was never the point, the understanding was." I said, "And what did it contain?" She looked at me, green eyes across a small table in October drizzle. She said, "Approximately what I said in the break room, that I had asked you in March because the asking meant more than the practical framing I had given it. That I understood what your yes meant, and had been operating on that understanding for 2 weeks before you rescinded. And that the rescinding had not changed the understanding, it had made it something I was carrying rather than something I was acting on." I said, "Say the harder part." She said, "I told you that losing those 2 weeks was harder than I had expected it to be. That I had spent 2 weeks understanding what it was like to be someone whose feeling was returned, and then spent the following months trying to put that knowledge back somewhere it could not reach me." I said, "Did it work?" She said, "No." She said, "I also wrote that I had loved the 2 years at the bench, not only romantically or not in a way I had the language for yet, but specifically. The accumulation of the Thursdays and the titrations and the way you engaged with problems you were not sure you could solve, and the specific way you said my name when you were frustrated with yourself, and the 7 seconds you took every time before asking a question you thought was too basic, which was never too basic, and I told you that multiple times and you did it anyway. I had loved all of it, and did not know how to say so in any register other than the one I used." I said, "The practical register." She said, "Yes." I said, "The prom invite?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Was there a version in the letter of what you wanted? Not what you were carrying, what you wanted?" She said, "The letter had a version of what I would have said if the conditions were right. The conditions being exactly this. No clipboard, not in the building, a table, October. No professional frame around either of us." I said, "What would you have said?" She looked at me, and then she said it. Without preamble, without the practical framing she had been using since the waiting room 2 weeks ago. She said, "I have been in love with you since the second Thursday in November of junior year. Specifically, not in the general way you have a feeling and manage it and get on with things. In the way that becomes part of how you understand yourself, what you are capable of feeling, what you are capable of wanting, what you are apparently patient enough to carry for 11 years without putting it down." The coffee place was very quiet. I said, "November? Which Thursday?" She said, "The Unit 4 problem set. You had gotten the first 3 steps right and made an error on the 4th that invalidated the whole sequence. Instead of starting over, you went back to the 4th step and corrected it and ran the correction through the rest of the sequence and arrived at the right answer with the wrong method entirely visible in the work. I told you the method was wrong. You said the answer was right. I said the answer reached by the wrong method is worse than the wrong answer reached by the right method, because at least the wrong answer shows you where you went wrong. You thought about it. You said you might be right about that. And then you erased the whole sequence and started over." I stared at her. She said, "I have no explanation for why that was the specific moment. It simply was." I said, "That is a very specific thing to remember." She said, "I told you what I was carrying was specific." I said, "I would like to say something." She looked at me, ready in the way she was always ready for things she had been expecting, not braced, not armored, just present. I said yes in March because I was already half in love with you and had no language for it. I rescinded because I was afraid of what saying yes to you meant about me and because Marcus Hale was a way of not having to figure any of that out yet. I have spent 11 years figuring it out. I have had the full honest accounting for about 4 years, and I have done nothing useful with it, because every time I thought about looking you up, I could hear myself on the phone in March, and I did not know how to stand in front of those words, she said. So she didn't have to worry about it. I said, those words specifically. Yes. She said, I need you to know that I understood, eventually, what those words were and what they were not. The anger lasted approximately 1 year. After the anger, I understood the shape of the thing fully enough that the anger was no longer the primary response. I said, what was the primary response after the anger? She said, the understanding that the conversation we would eventually need to have would require me to say things I had not finished finding words for, and that finding the words was the work that needed to happen first. I said, you did the work. She said, I did the work. I said, we are both responsible for 11 years of that. She said, yes. I said, I'm sorry for my share. She said, I accept that. I'm sorry for mine. I said, I accept that too. We looked at each other across the table. Outside the window, the drizzle came down on the ordinary Thursday street, a city doing its evening things entirely unconcerned with what was happening in this narrow room. Outside the window, the drizzle came down on the ordinary Thursday street. I said, the letter, the last line. She was quiet for a moment. She said, the last line was this. I think you already knew. I think you have known since March of senior year, and I think not knowing has been a choice you have been making rather than a condition you have been in. And I think when the conditions are right, you will stop making that choice. And I hope when you do, it is possible that I will still be somewhere findable. I held that for a long time. I said, you hoped I would find you. She said, I planted one piece of evidence. I moved back to the same city. I did not look you up, but I moved back. I said, and then I walked into your DMV. She said, and then you walked into my DMV. I said, because my driving record was a disaster. She said, the entry mechanism was not elegant. I said, it worked though. She said, it worked. We stayed for another hour. The coffee place filled and emptied around us in the way coffee places fill and empty on Thursday evenings. The steady democratic traffic of people who needed a warm room and something to drink and somewhere to be for a little while. We talked about the 11 years in the way you talk about them when you are on the other side of them, not with grief or recrimination, but with the honest accounting of two people who have arrived at the same place from different distances and are comparing routes. She told me about the civil engineering work, the transit safety assessments, the infrastructure projects, the specific satisfaction of a road design that moved people through a city safely and efficiently and did not require anyone to perform heroism to use it. She talked about it the way she talked about everything she genuinely cared about, with the focused, unsentimental attention of someone who knew exactly why they cared and did not need to perform that knowing for anyone else. I told her about the studio, the UX work, the projects I was proudest of, the ones that had not gone well and what I had learned from them. The apartment I had moved into after the suspension made the farther one impractical. The route through the park I ran 3 mornings a week, and how October was the version that made you understand why people stayed in this city through the difficult seasons. She said, the infrastructure of a city is easier to love in October. I said, because everything else is stripped back. She said, because everything reveals its actual structure. This was the most Vera Kinsley sentence I had ever heard, and I told her so. The corner of her mouth moved. 1 millimeter. She said, you run the same route every morning. I said, it is a very good route. She said, I know that park. My office is 2 blocks from the north entrance. I looked at her. She looked at me. There was a brief, specific moment of recognition, what it meant that we had been 2 blocks from the same park for approximately 4 years and had no mechanism for knowing it until a traffic violation and a DMV evaluation and 3 business days conspired to change that. She said quietly, I think that is a little absurd. I said, only a little. She said, Yes. Only a little. We paid and walked out into the October evening. The rain had thinned to the kind of drizzle that does not require an umbrella but does something to your hair and your jacket and the city around you. The pavement was reflecting everything above it in versions that were both accurate and slightly distorted streetlights, storefronts, the yellow lights of passing cars. We walked without having decided to walk, which was the natural consequence of leaving a coffee place and not saying goodbye, which was the natural consequence of neither of us being finished yet. She had her hands in her jacket pockets. Her hair was doing things in the light drizzle that the pin would normally have prevented and was now free to do, which was information about the difference between the professional version of Vera and this version, and I was cataloging it the way I had always cataloged her details, not because I decided to, but because it was what I had always done in proximity to her, and apparently there was no available mechanism for stopping. I said, November, the second Thursday, Unit 4. She said, the second step after the correction was also wrong initially. You caught it before I said anything. I said, I don't remember that part. She said, I know. You moved through it too fast to register it. You were focused on the corrected fourth step being right. I said, you remember the second step. She said, I told you. I was specific. I said, you have detailed memory of a problem set from 11 years ago. She said, I have detailed memory of 11 years of one specific person. The problem set is part of that. I said, what else? She said, what do you mean? I said, what else is in the detailed memory? She was quiet for a moment. We turned onto a residential block, the coffee shops giving way to brownstones, the particular quiet of streets where people lived rather than transacted. She said, the way you argued with the textbook when the textbook was wrong, which was not always, sometimes you were wrong and the textbook was right, but you could only determine this after the argument. The way you smelled of something I never identified but would recognize anywhere. The 7 seconds before a question you thought was too basic, which was never too basic. The way you laughed when you were frustrated with yourself, short, helpless, genuinely not finding it funny. I said, I still do the 7 seconds. She said, I know. You did it in the break room before you said I used the wrong words. I said, you counted. She said, I notice the things I have always noticed. It doesn't turn off. I said, I catalog things too. She said, I know you do. I said, what's in the catalog? She looked at the brownstones. A light in an upper window where someone was doing something ordinary with their Thursday evening. She said, the way you hold your hands at 10 and 2 even when you are no longer being evaluated. You did it leaving the lot after the first retest. The form was done. You did it anyway. The way you say the accurate thing in the specific register, that means you have been sitting with it for a while and you are finally putting it down somewhere. You used that register in the break room. The way you looked at the window in the break room when you were deciding whether to say the thing you had come in to say, and then said it anyway. The cedar soap. I have been using it since my second year of college, because I used it once at a friend's apartment in Portland, and it smelled like something I was already familiar with but could not place. It was the soap in the lab supply closet at our high school. I have been using it for 7 years. I did not understand this until I was sitting in that car and smelled it and understood that I had been carrying this too, in a different form, for longer than I had known. I stopped walking. She stopped beside me. I said, you have been using cedar soap for 7 years because of the supply closet at our high school. She said, I understood the origin when you were in the car, not before. I said, you smelled the cedar in the car. She said, yes. I said, and I smelled it too. She said, I know. I said, Vera. That is the most absurd thing that has happened in 11 years. She said, it is quite specific. I said, it is the most romantic thing anyone has ever accidentally told me. She said, that was not the intended register. I said, I know. It was accurate anyway. The corner of her mouth moved, further than a millimeter. We started walking again. The drizzle on the leaves, the brownstones, the ordinary Thursday in the city. We talked about other things, the transit project she had been working on and the navigation problem I was stuck on, and she asked one question about my problem that reorganized my entire approach to it in 30 seconds. Which was the kind of thing she had always done at the bench and apparently still did in civilian clothes on a Thursday evening in the rain. I told her this. She said she did not know how to ask questions that did not do that. I said I knew. That was not a complaint. She said she knew it was not. We arrived at a small square, one of those urban spaces that exist for the people who live around them, rather than for anyone passing through. A fountain off for the season. Benches around its perimeter. A large maple doing something spectacular with its October leaves in the dark, in the drizzle, the kind of performance that does not require an audience but changes quality when it has one. We stopped without deciding to stop. The fountain was quiet. The maple was there. It had been doing this specific thing with its October leaves all evening, and we had arrived at the right moment in the right light for it to be what it was, not staged, not coincidental, just the maple being the maple in the time of year when maples were most fully themselves. I said, the conditions, when I filed the form, the question I was asking. She said, yes. I said, what is the answer? She looked at me. In the square, in the drizzle, with the October maple and the quiet fountain, Vera Kinsley looked at me with those green eyes, and did not manage the look or frame it or contain it in anything professional or practical. She said, yes. She said it the way she said accurate things, simply, completely, without needing to add more, because the word was already the full thing. I said, okay. She said, okay. I said, I would like to do March differently now, if you are willing to let that be the next thing. She said, I filed the letter in the kitchen sink and bought a lighter specifically for the burning and kept what I was carrying for 11 years through 2 cities and 1 relationship and a master's degree and a career pivot and 4 years at a DMV. I think I am willing to let it be the next thing. I said, that is a very long and specific way of saying yes. She said, it is accurate. She took one hand from her jacket pocket and briefly touched my arm through the jacket just for a moment, a point of contact, chosen, and then let go. I kissed her. It was patient and unhurried. It was the kind of thing that happens when 2 people have had 11 years to understand exactly what they are doing and have finally, in an October square, in a light drizzle, arrived at the place where doing it is the only remaining honest thing. We stood in the square. The drizzle came down. The maple was doing its best work yet. I said, the approach was clean. She said, yes. I said, and the position? She said, much better, though I would want to run it a few more times to confirm. I said, that is the most Vera Kinsley thing anyone has ever said. She said, you have raised precision as a complaint before. I said, I have never complained about your precision. Not once, in 11 years. She considered. Then, no, you haven't. I said. I will not be starting now. She said. Noted. We stood in the quiet square with the fountain off and the maple spectacular and the city doing its ordinary Thursday things, entirely unconcerned with what was happening in this small space, which was 2 people doing something they had been approaching for 11 years and had finally arrived at. I said, I need to call Danny. She said, I know. I said, she will be very pleased with herself. She said, she deserves to be. She told you first. I said, she told you too? She said. She found my professional DMV email address through channels I was unable to reconstruct and sent one message at 2 in the afternoon on the Tuesday after the first retest. It contained 4 words. I said, what were they? She said, she's always known Vera. I looked at her. She said, tell her the form was the right instrument for the situation. I said, she will say she already knew. She said, she did already know. I said, the letter, I'm glad you wrote it. She said, I am also glad. I said, even though you burned it. She said, I burned it because I had to complete the experiment. But I took the answer with me. I said, what was the answer? She said, that I had been right about what I was carrying. that the carrying was worth it if the conditions eventually resolved correctly, and that I hoped they would. I said, "They did." She said, "Yes, they did." I called Danny. She picked up on the first ring. I said, "The approach and position are both clean now." The sound she made was one I had heard from her approximately 4 times in 31 years, and only when something she had been waiting for a very long time had finally happened. It was not a quiet sound. I looked at Vera, who was looking at the park entrance we had drifted toward, and the corner of her mouth was at its furthest point yet all the way, the full version, the smile I had been cataloging in millimeters for 2 weeks and had never seen completely until right now. It was exactly as specific as 11 years of anticipating it had led me to believe it would be. Not better, not different, specific in precisely the way the 11 years had always suggested it would be specific, which meant the 11 years had been carrying accurate information the whole time. Danny was saying something on the phone about 12 years and vindication, and I told you so, in the sequence that meant she was going to be saying versions of this for some time, which was correct and entirely deserved. I let her. I watched Vera watching the park. She said, "I would like to walk into the park, if you are not tired of walking." I said, "I've been running this park for 2 years." She said, "I know. My office is 2 blocks from the north entrance. I have been running here for 3 years. I've seen you here twice, Wednesdays at 6. I recognized you the second time." I said, "You saw me in this park and didn't say anything." She said, "We did not yet have the conditions." I said, "What time is 6:15 on Fridays?" She looked at me. I said, "I have been meaning to add a Friday run." She said, 6:15 at the north entrance." I said, "That works." She said, "Good." We started the Friday runs 2 weeks later. She was at the north entrance at 6:14 when I arrived, which was entirely consistent with everything I had ever known about her. We ran the loop in the gray November morning and talked about the transit project and the navigation redesign and various things that were not about either of those but needed talking about anyway. Her stride was longer than mine and she did not shorten it, which meant I ran slightly faster on Fridays than on the other days, which was the best reason I had encountered in some time to run faster. I did not mention this to her. She almost certainly knew. The following Thursday we had dinner, a real dinner, not coffee, at a restaurant with actual food and a reservation, and enough time to not be running toward anything else. She wore the dark green jacket again. We talked for 3 hours, and then walked in the November dark, and arrived at a corner where I had to go one way and she had to go the other, and she stood on the corner with her hands in her pockets and looked at me the way she looked at things she had finished deciding about. She said, "The Friday run is a good addition to the week." I said, "I agree." She said, "I think the Tuesday-Wednesday overlap in the park is underexplored." I said, "I could run Tuesdays at 6:15. She said, "The north entrance." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She walked in her direction. I walked in mine. At the corner I looked back. She was also looking back, which was the kind of information that takes 11 years to earn and arrives in the most ordinary way, a wet November corner, lamplight on rain-slicked pavement, 2 people who had finally arrived at something after a very long approach. She was also looking back, which was information, and the lamplight was doing something useful to her face. And it was November in the city, and everything was wet and ordinary, and I had filed a government form 5 weeks ago, and it had been exactly the right instrument for the situation. Patrice saw us together on a Saturday morning in late November, when I was running a different route and the paths intersected near the fountain. She was walking a small, serious dog that appeared to have inherited her personal philosophy. She looked at us with the warm and comprehensive awareness of a woman who had been watching a particular situation develop from a front row seat for several weeks and had come to a settled conclusion about where it was going. She said, "Malone." I said, "Patrice." She said, "Good morning." She said it to both of us, which was the first time she had said it to both of us simultaneously, which meant she had made a decision about what we were. She said, "You are not currently an active DMV examinee." I said, "No." She said, "Examiner Kinsley is no longer your examiner of record." I said, "Also correct." She looked between us, the comprehensive awareness doing what it always did, taking in the full information, cataloging it, returning exactly what was required. The dog was also looking between us, which was information about the dog. She said, "Good." She walked on with her dog, neither of them looking back. Vera looked at me. I said, "That is Patrice's version of an official blessing." She said, "I will take it." I said, "Me too." We ran on. November morning, the park, the fountain off for the season. The trees past their October drama and into the quieter, more structural beauty of the season after all form, no performance, entirely itself. The city doing its ordinary Saturday things, entirely unconcerned with the fact that two people were running through it who had arrived here from a very specific direction. The approach had been 11 years, the position had required some recalibration. Both were clean now.